Tonight I wanted to talk about writing clear code. And I named this presentation Achieving Clarity in Swift, but it's really not about Swift. It's about writing code in general. It's just through the lens of Swift. So I found this intriguing quote some time ago. It says, programs must be written for people to read and only incidentally for machines to execute. Let that sink in. You might be thinking that it's an exaggerated quote, and it probably is. After all, the code we write is more than just incidentally for computers to run. But underlying is a very important idea that I hope to get across. It's something that I think a lot of programmers don't fully appreciate. And it's the idea that the code we write shouldn't be comprehensible only for the compiler. It should be easy to understand for the human reader, for programmers, for us. And not just for you at the time you write it, but for other people too, and for years down the line. I believe we should write code with clarity in mind. We should try writing code in such a way that, not unlike good design, it feels almost inevitable. It feels obvious. Of course, writing obvious code is not an obvious task. It takes time, editing, skill, and good taste. Also, a lot of programmers have a natural tendency toward writing clever code. And let me tell you, I hate clever code. Clever code makes you feel good. It makes you feel smart when you write it. But the problem is, 6 months down the line, even you don't remember what you meant when you wrote it. It seems like a cool idea at the time you write it, but you end up with something that's hard to understand. It's hard to work with because it's clever instead of simple. So clarity, or rather, I think writing clear code makes you a better programmer, and it makes for better programs. It takes a while longer up front to write it, but you end up with something that's much easier to work with. You get code where it takes a lot less effort to read and understand it. I would go as far as to say that when you were working with clear code, I think you can avoid making bugs oftentimes, because how can you screw up something that feels instantly obvious? It's much easier for things to go wrong when you work with something that's difficult to understand, something that's complex and not clear and simple and obvious. So if nothing else, I hope we can all agree on this point, on this idea that clarity is important and that investing in clear code is worth it. Now, obviously, writing clear code is a lot of things. Clarity is not just one aspect. It's not just one technique. It's this whole approach, this whole idea, value in how you write your code. But I was initially prompted to think those thoughts in the context of Swift because I used to write Objective-C for some years before that. And over time, I came to believe that Objective-C often has a mistaken idea about what clarity is. I often felt like Objective-C and the frameworks around it, and sometimes the community around it, often confuse clarity with verbosity. And again, clarity is a lot of things, but where this struggle often showed up is in naming things. And Objective-C, of course, names things like this. String bar replaces the occurrence of string with string. It's beautiful. It almost reads like poetry. Some of it doesn't even fit on the slide. And what's wrong with this? Here's one example. And I know a lot of you are iOS programmers, so you probably know what this method does. But if you didn't already know, could you figure it out? There's a good chance you could, I think, because there's the name, which tells you something, and you have the context around it, right? You see what comes in and what goes out. So it's pretty clear. But if you didn't already know, What's that? What are components? Have you heard of components? Does it mean something special? Is there an NS component? I don't know. So don't get me wrong, it's still pretty clear. The method name here is like, 95% clear. But the truth is, the idea is that even something as simple as this is still complex enough that it's impossible to fully and accurately explain it in just a few words. So we have like 95% clarity, but it's totally verbose. And I don't think it has to be this way. There's an alternative. Here's a piece of Ruby for you. String split new line. What does it do? Well, guess what? It splits a string with a new line. I don't know about you, but it feels pretty clear to me. It's not really clearer than Objective-C, I don't think. But the point is that adding more words doesn't always help. What if that's not enough, though? What if you don't know what components mean, and you want to find out, or you see some method name for the first time in your life, and you want to find out what it does? What do you do? How do you find out? Well, that's going to depend on the language, the environment you work with, but certainly in the context of Swift and Objective-C, you just alt-click on it, right? I mean, we have the tools. We have Xcode. When you don't know what something does, you alt-click on it, you read the description, and now you know. And once you know, split is just as clear as components separated by string. Now, if you've been writing Objective-C for a long time, if you've been in this community and follow these conventions, you probably want to stop me right there. You're probably thinking, well, why not name this component separated by string? You might argue that even if by a small margin it is clearer, and like, what's the point? What I'm trying to achieve? Why save a bunch of characters? I mean, clarity trumps brevity, right? Yeah, it does. Sure, it's more important to be clear than to make something short. But what I think a lot of programmers don't fully appreciate is the fact that brevity is a factor in clarity. Verbosity doesn't come for free. It's true that we have modern tools like autocompletion that help us in writing those log method names, but we still have to read them. It takes some real effort to mentally parse and understand a piece of source code, right? So even though clear code is obviously better than confusing code, it's also true, I think, that short code is easier and faster to read than verbose code. And what you have to do, I think, is find the sweet spot between brevity and verbosity. That's where clarity lies. And the way to achieve that is by removing all of the noise, all of the words, the punctuation, everything that doesn't really add any information. All of the things that don't really say anything, don't really help you understand what something does or means. So I've said that, something like split is just as clear of a method name in practice as components separated by string. That, replace would be just as clear as string by replacing currents of string with string. But in the end, I would argue that replace is clearer than the Objective-C name because it lacks all of the noise. Like, why would you say string 3 times in a method name? What's the point? Why are you trying to encode type information in the name? It makes no sense. There's no point in doing that. I mean, it's a statically typed language, so if you need to find out, you can always alt-click on it. And in the vast majority of cases, this is going to be instantly obvious from the context. So why say that? Or these words, by, of, with. Objective-C does that a lot. It tries to make things sound like English, but it really doesn't, and it really doesn't help. Those words carry exactly 0 information. They don't explain anything. So why not just say replace? I mean, really, why not? It's just a simple word. It's just this one simple verb. And yeah, it doesn't have all of these words to try to explain what it does. But in practice, is going to be just as clear, if not clearer, because the name still tells you a lot. The context, what arguments go in and what comes out still tell you a lot. And when in doubt, you can always check that. But it has the advantage that it's so short, so you can read and scan for it instantly. You don't have to go through all the text to see the point of your code. So remove the noise. That's how you achieve clarity. Now, I call this achieving clarity in Swift, so let's talk about Swift. It's Swift that urgently prompted me to think once again about clarity of code through the lens of brevity versus verbosity, because the idea of removing the noise is all over Swift. Like with type inference. Why be explicit about types within method bodies where it's almost universally obvious, right? Why repeat ourselves like that? I mean, it's just noise. It doesn't really say anything, so let's just burn it, right? Or why would you have to type semicolons or pointer asterisks or unnecessary parentheses and other punctuation? Just burn it. Or the fact that Swift has all sorts of shortcut forms for closures. Or that, like any normal language, it has operators. Or things like optional chaining. Or here's another example. This is how you make a simple window object on the Mac. And this part is what always kept bothering me. Like the window dimensions are actually the only thing that's interesting here. Everything else I left standard, which makes it noise. But Swift comes to rescue because finally you can define default values for arguments. So you could define the window initializer like so. And that will bring this to this. And all of these examples matter, I think, because less code to understand is a good thing, right? You don't have to fish out meaning from all of the noise. Verbosity isn't all good. It's not as simple as add more words to explain something, right? Oftentimes that's exactly what you have to do for clarity, but oftentimes you only end up adding noise. And instead of helping me understand something, you just add to the volume of text I have to read and understand. Now, again, clarity is a lot of things, and I would like you to sort of write clear code, but I couldn't possibly cover all facets of it. I don't know all facets of it. But I just wanted to show another example of how I sort of tried to put those ideas, this philosophy of naming things, and sort of trying to achieve greater clarity by removing noise to how we approach as designing APIs. So I had this little sort of fun project called Swift APIs, where I would take an existing Objective-C API and sort of try to make it more Swift-like and more nice and less verbose. So say hello to NSTimer. I'm essentially calling this method at the bottom every second to print hello world to the console. Simple task, and like clearly not a huge deal, but still a surprisingly big chunk of code for a very trivial task. So just as an example, let's try to make it less verbose. And I'll start with the method name. All right, so we have scheduled timer with time interval, and I'll go over it word by word. So scheduled, is this word important? It is, actually, because we're scheduling the timer in the run loop, not merely returning it. But timer, we just said NSTimer. Why are we repeating ourselves? Really, what are we adding to the understanding of the programmer with this word, or with? Really, a word that carries no information. And time, again, it's a timer, right? So right off the bat, let's remove all of that. We have this, which I think is a bit better, but we still have all of that, right? And one thing that always annoyed me with NSTimer, and it's a really old API, so it doesn't even use all of the Objective-C features. But one annoying thing is that you always have to define a new method just to use it. And sometimes it makes sense, you would want to do this anyway, but I find with NSTimer, you usually want to run just 1 or 2 lines of code. And in those cases, it will be just easier to use a closure. So let's just do that, remove target selector, and use a closure, right? And now we can also get rid of user info because it's only useful with target selector, and we have this. And it's a lot shorter. I think it's quite a lot better, and it will be a completely fine API. But let's just try doing something different. Just because I noticed that with NSTimer, when you have the repeats parameter, you always end up passing a literal true or false. You never end up passing an argument, right? So what if we sort of try to remove that and embed this information in the method name? And instead of saying schedule repeats true, let's just say every 1 second, right? NSTimer every 1. It sort of makes sense. But again, just removing noise is only part of the equation. What I'm really trying to do here is to make the API clearer. As far as clarity is concerned, the 1.0 thing sort of annoys me. Like what's 1.0? I know that it means 1 second, but why can't we just say 1 second? So here's the idea I stole from Ruby on Rails. Let's just add properties on numbers and say 1.second. And you can also define, seconds and minute and hours that return 10 and this time interval. And you can define it in Swift on double, so it works both with integers and floating points. So that's quite nice. And I don't know about you, but I like the results. Like it's pretty cool. It reads like English, though that's not really the point. It's really short. And want a non-repeating timer, replace every with after, and as timer after 1 second. Still sort of makes sense. And the point is that we started with all of this, and we got here. And I don't know about you, but I don't think we sacrificed clarity to achieve brevity. No, we increased clarity by removing all of the noise, right? So just as a quick recap, here are the 4 ideas I'm trying to sell you today. Idea number 1, focus on clarity. Make it one of your priorities, one of your values when you write your code. Because clarity is an important factor in quality, both of the program and the programmer. And clear code is just much easier to work with. So when you're writing something for the long run, it's truly worth it. So focus on clarity. Idea number 2, don't write clever code. It's tempting, I know, but it serves no one. It seems fun. I mean, it's clever, right? But it's so much better to write something in a way that's not clever, but simple, obvious, clear. And that's not always easy, but it's worth it. So don't write clever code. Idea number 3, clarity is not achieved by being verbose. It is achieved by maximizing the signal-to-noise ratio. Brevity is never the point. However, it is an important factor in clarity, because reading and understanding takes effort. So clarity is not the same as verbosity. And finally, idea number 4, I can't count, is don't write your Swift the same way you write your Objective-C. Swift is a different language. It enables and I think requires a different approach. And I know not all of you here are iOS programmers, but whatever your language or framework of choice are, just keep an open mind about the way you write your code and think different. Thanks.
In one of the first slides, you mentioned that constantly repeating the type of variable in a statically typed language like Objective-C is a mistake. But on the other hand, we don't have method overloading in Objective-C in the same way as we have in Java or C++. So how do you cope with that? I mean, you can have a method like init with, let's say, string, and init with int, and init with so on.
Right. So, I mean, I guess you're not familiar with Swift.
Go back to that slide, it would be more obvious. Could you?
Which one?
Okay, it was one. Okay, so I would like to be able to replace the occurrences of string with, let's say, int, and want that int to be casted.
Right. So you instead of passing, string as a parameter, you interpolate int in a string and just replace string with string. I mean, yeah, you could make a method that replaces strings inside of strings with integers, but I don't see what's the point of that.
Okay, maybe that question was too specific. So, okay, I need a minute to think that over. So sorry.
Okay.
If you like compare Swift and Objective-C, what do you like more in Objective-C than in Swift?
Oh.
Yeah. Come on.
No, I do appreciate Objective-C's dynamicness. I mean, I come from like Ruby background, Objective-C also, so I kind of grew to appreciate things not being static but being dynamic, and I like that. Swift is much less of that. Swift really focuses on things being statically checked at compile time, and it's a new world for me. I mean, it's not something I'm used to from before Swift, right? But on the other hand, I like that Swift sort of tries to strike a balance, and even though it's mostly about static typing and static everything, it still has plenty of ways to integrate with, Objective-C and other dynamic stuff. So yeah.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
What you don't like in Swift?
Oh. Okay, so what I don't like about Swift? The obvious one, I guess, which is the lack of stability. Objective-C is boring. It had some new features, but essentially, it's a pretty old language. And Swift is exciting because it changes all the time, which means it breaks all the time, and the tools are, they need work. So compilation is slow. Sometimes the produced code is slow. Sometimes you have to work around a compiler limitation or a compiler crash or something like that. And it gets better and fast, but it's still sort of something that there's always on your mind when you write Swift.
Thank you.
More questions? All right, thanks.